So let's continue on with our unit on percentages. So in lesson 2, we're going to be looking how we talked about percentages being out of 100% in lesson 1, but now we're going to talk about how it could be more than 100%, it could be less than 100%, depending on the numbers that we're. So I'm going to ask that you continue to take notes as we did all throughout unit 1. And then if I walk around and I see that you have done your notes, that I know you're participating, you're following along, and then I can try to help answer your questions that you might have by the end of this lesson. This is not a difficult lesson, but I am going to show you a different way. So some of the notes that I asked you to take today, you'll probably need notebook paper. And if you have it on notebook paper, you can put it in your reading, or excuse me, in your math folder, or we can tape it or staple it into your math book. The point is that I'm going to be teaching you a couple processes that you'll be able to use from this point forward, and will also help you on your tests as well as your homework. So when we're looking at what I can do after I do lesson 2.2, I'm going to be able to identify not only our percents out of 100, but we're also talking how I could have more than 100%, I could have less than 1%, right? So we'll do a review connection back to science as we talked about yesterday. But as I'm looking at this then, when I can tell that I could have more than 100%, I could have less than 1%, then they're starting us out with the idea that let's just look at the regular fraction going back to lesson 1.1 of 3 to 4. And if I have 3 to 4, then I set it up in a ratio form that looks like a fraction where the 3's on top, the 4's on bottom, right? And then if I've done that, then I know that I can multiply by 25. Well, if I don't know that I can multiply 4 by 25 to get 100, then I pick up my handy dandy calculator. 100 divided by 25 or 4 equals 25, and I know I'm multiplying by 25s. Now notice what they've done for you, right? We're multiplying the bottom by 25, so we're multiplying the top by 25. So if we know we can do that to get our answer, and then that tells us that that is 75%, then we're good to go. But some of these are going to get a little bit more complicated to try to figure out what I'm multiplying by. So we're going to look at this once again as a division problem. Once again, when I have a rate or a ratio, and I have set it up in my fraction form, then my top number is going to go inside of my division box. And then my bottom number is going to go on the outside of my division box, right? So I have my dividend inside, I have my divisor on the outside, and then because it is a smaller number divided by a bigger number, I know it's a decimal. So I'm going to add my decimal and I'm going to bring it straight up. And then I start asking, well, can 4 go into 3? No, it can't. So I know I'm going to have to add a 0 and then divide. So 4 will go into 30 7 times. That's where you can use your handy dandy calculator if you're not sure. 30 divided by 4 is going to give you 7 and stuff. So I just want to keep the 7. Then I know 7 times 4 is 28. Subtract, I get 2. Add a 0 and bring it down. And 4 goes in 25 times. So here's the note that I want you to add to notebook paper because there's not going to be enough room in your book. So I'm going to go rather quick through this, but please pause the video as you're going through and make sure you get all the pieces written down. All right. So when I'm doing my percentages, first part of the note that I want you to write down is if I have a decimal number, then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my decimal 2 times. Well, which way am I going to go? Well, if it's a decimal going into a percentage, then I'm going to move it to the right. Once I move it 2 times to the right, always 2 times, never less, never more, then I just add my percent sign. So pause the video and make sure you write that down in your notes. Now that you have that written down, now we look at the example that we just have from that division. So if I have 0.75 and I know I need to make 0.75 or 75 hundredths into a percentage, then I'm going to do those steps. I'm going to go to my decimal point and I'm going to move it 2 times to the right. Always 2 times, always to the right when I'm going from decimal into a percentage. Once I do that, then I just add my percent sign. So what I end up with is 75%, which is what we found out in the examples they gave us using equivalent ratios. So let's look at this example then. So this, down at the bottom of the page, this shows us how I could have more than 100%, right? So if we're looking at what it's talking about, it says in 2019, it rained more than it did in 2017. To compare the rainfall in 2019 to, so we know that's our first number compared to our second number. So 2019's rain amount to 2017's rain amount. And they give us the ratio of 5:4. So notice the fraction that they set up, the 5 has to go on top because that's the order that the ratio is written. If I have 5/4 and I figure out that I'm multiplying once again the 4 by 25 to get 100, then I have to multiply the top by 25. And 5 times 25 is 125. So I just take the top number of my fraction and add a percent sign. That becomes my percentage of 125%. If I know I have 5:4 and I just want to divide to find that answer, I'm going to go through the same process that I just went through a moment before. My top number is my dividend. It goes inside my box. My bottom number, my denominator, is my divisor, so it's going to go on the outside of the box. Then I know I'm going to be dividing, so I ask, will 4 go into 5? It will, one time, because 1 times 4 is 4, and I subtract them and I get a remainder of 1. I can't have a remainder when I'm doing these problems. So I'm going to add my decimal. I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to add a 0. I'm going to bring it down. And then I ask, will 4 go into 10? They will, twice, because 2 times 4 gives me 8. When I subtract those, I get a 2. I add a 0. I bring it down. I continue my division. 4 goes into 20 5 times, because 5 times 4 is 20. And therefore, I would have a remainder of 0. Once I have 1.25 or 1 25/100ths, then I just follow the same note that we just did on the previous slide. I'm going to move my decimal from left to right 2 times. So when I have 1.25, I move my decimal 2 times and add my percent sign. I go back to what they have told me. It's the same as 125%. All right. Once again, I know I'm going fast because the videos don't need to be really long because you can just pause them. Pause it, rewatch it as many times as you need to. All right, so when I start looking at this, then they say, well, if I give you a grid, can you tell me the percent that we're talking about? Well, that really should be pretty easy, I'm hoping. We should know that the grid that's 10 by 10 is automatically 100. And then if I have 2 of them, then I have 2 groups of 100. When I look at the one that's partial, then, once again, each column is worth a value of 10. So I count how many groups of 10 I would have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I count my individual ones. I show my work by putting down how many are there and I circle it so I know those are individual ones. So when I start doing all that math then, how many whole grids did I have? Well, that would be 2. So I know that's 200. How many squares are shaded in on the third grid? Well, 63, because I had 6 groups of 10 plus the 3 individuals. That gives me 63 when I put them all together. So all together is one of those key words that is on the front page of your math packet. You can always highlight it in the addition sign because all together means we're going to add. When I add 263, then I'm going to have 263. Should be pretty easy, I'm hoping. If they ask me to write that as a ratio, once again, the book is showing us how many different ways we can write ratios. We can write it with a colon. We can write it with the word 2, or we can write it as a fraction. There it is. I don't know why it showed up in a different spot. But overall, what I end up with when I have all of those grids and then the partial grid colored in the way it is, then I have 263 boxes that are colored in, so it's 263%. So what about this one? You give it a shot, see if you can figure out what that percentage would be. So pause the video now, do it, and then check your answer. So what you should have ended up with is that first one is 100, right? And then when I count my whole rows or columns of 10, I have 3 of them. And then individually, I'm going to have 7 little boxes. So once again, I write a 7, I circle it because I know I'm adding 7. And when I take 100 plus 30 plus 7, I should have ended up with 130%. All right, so let's go in and look at what they're talking about on the next one. All right, so they're saying, well, here's a scenario, and this is going to be another note that I really want you to write down because it's going to help your life much easier on several of these problems. So if we have a kitten, we know when it's first born, it's 5 ounces, and 3 weeks later, it's going to be much bigger. Well, how much bigger are we talking about? It says it's going to weigh twice as much. So we have some special words when it comes to how we multiply. So I'd like you to write down the special words, tell us how to multiply by hundreds for percentages, because that's what all these notes are about. Then I want you to make this chart. Inside of a box, I want you to have up at the top left word, then regular, so if I'm doing regular numbers, and then percentage, so that I know what my columns are telling me. And then my first note that I'm going to write down is that the word twice tells me to do what? Well, if it's just regular numbers, I'm going to multiply by 2. If it's percentages, I'm going to multiply by 200%, because 1 is 100%. One whole 10 by 10 grid colored in, that's 100 little boxes, so that's 100%. So if I would have 2 of them, I'd have 200%. So when we talk about what's going on here, then, if they're asking me how much would it weigh, well, if I know that it started out as 5 ounces and I am going to be twice as much, I just simply multiply by 2, that's going to give me 10. So it'd be 10 ounces. If I want to know what percentage I'm increasing by, I don't really have to do all of this math. They're showing you how you get your 200%, because if you have 10 over 5, and that's your equivalent ratio that I'm creating into a denominator of 100, then what's my numerator going to be? I would have to multiply both of them by 20 in this scenario. So I'd end up with 200%. But I'm just telling you in your note that the word twice, that tells you that that's 200%, or multiplying by 2 with regular numbers. There's 2 more I want you to add to your note. So if it says 3 times, then that's showing that I'm multiplying by 3, which is just 300%. If it says 4 times, it's multiplying by 4, and that's 400%. And you could fill out that grid going on and on and on forever. If it says 100 times bigger, that would be times 100 in regular numbers, or multiplying by not 100%, would it? No, it'd be multiplying by 10,000. So we just need to make sure that we understand what it is that it's telling me to do. When it asks me to draw it, then all I would do is draw 2 squares and fill them in. That should be pretty easy. All right, so now we check what it's telling me here. So there's a lot of information, right? And it says that the giraffe is going to be 3 times as tall as it was at birth. Well, if it asks you to write a percent, which it does, to compare those, I don't need to do the math. I don't need to set up the ratio and find the equivalent ratio with a denominator of 100. I just need to know from that previous note that when we're talking about 3 times, we're talking about a percentage that is 300% bigger. That's it. If I just know what those terms mean, then I'm good to go, and I don't have any math that I need to show. That's why we wrote the note down. If it asks me to then create the grid, then I just need 3 grids filled in, because once again, each 10 by 10 grid has 100 boxes in it, all filled in, so it's 100 boxes, 1 grid makes 100%. All right, so the second half of this lesson, hold on and take your notes and pay attention. I'm trying to make this less than 20 minutes, so you'll have plenty of time to watch it a couple times and pause it as many times as you need to make sure you get all your notes and understand it, so you are a successful mathematician on this lesson. So now we're going to shift gears in part 2 of this lesson and think about smaller percentages. So they're giving us all sorts of information here, but what I want us to focus in on is the idea that we have a ratio of 4,000 to 430,000. So the radius of the Earth is 4,000 to the radius of the sun, which is much bigger, at 430,000. They're going to show you if you set it up as a ratio of 4,000 to 430,000, and then ask yourself, well, what do I have to do to 430,000 to get 100? I would divide top and bottom by 4,300. I'm just going to tell you, skip all of that. It's okay, and it's a successful way of doing it, but I feel like it's going to be easier for you to remember. I'm going to take my first number in my ratio, if it's listed this way, or if it's written as a fraction, it's the top number. I'm going to put it inside my division box. My second number in my ratio, or my denominator, I'm going to divide by it. So I have my divisor, first number or top number, or excuse me, my dividend, my top number or my first number, and my divisor, the one on the outside, is my denominator or my second number. And then I can just pick up my handy dandy calculator. Where some of you are messing up is you're trying to type them in the order from left to right as they're shown on the paper. We can't do that, right? We have to read what it says. The problem says 4,000 divided by 430,000. And that's the way I have to type it into my calculator. So I pick up my handy dandy calculator and I type in 4,000 divided by 430,000 equals, and I'm going to see that I get 0.0093. So if I get 0.0093, then I look at the note that we took before. I have a number and I need to make it into a percentage. I'm simply going to shift my decimal 2 times to the right. When I shift it 2 times to the right, I put the decimal down and I add a percent sign. So my percentage becomes 0.93% or 93 hundredths of a percentage. So when we start looking at this box then and the grid that we're talking about, and I focus in on just one little box, then I can zoom in and I can see that only part of that little box is shaded in, because one box, once again, is 1%. There are 100 little boxes to make up one grid. That's why 100% is equal to one grid. So I have to make it almost one entire box. So that goes back to yesterday's science lesson, right? When we talked about all the mass of all the objects in the solar system other than the sun, that's going to make up less than 1% of all the mass in our solar system. So I did this grid to show you that this is a little itty bitty portion of what all the mass is outside of the sun. So we go through this process in the same way, right? So as we're looking at it, it says, so we're showing you that this one box, only 1/4 of it is shaded in, or 0.25 of it is shaded in. So if it's 1/4 or 0.25, 25 hundredths, well, then what percentage would that be? Well, it's just going to be 25%, right? Because it's going to be 0.25 or 25 hundredths of that entire grid. So 0.25 or 25 hundredths of a percent, or as they're showing you, you can also write that as 1/4 of a percent. Either way works as long as you're successful. So then we have to be able to interpret our grids. Well, how much is this going to be representing? So we know it's going to be less than 1 because not one whole box of our grid is filled in. So when we start talking about rows and columns, we said that we count them as wholes. And each one of those wholes, 1 through 10, is worth 10%, right? So if I get 2 full rows, I'd have 20%. 3 full rows would be 30%. Well, when I look at these and I start counting them, I need to realize that they're not worth 10. They're worth 1/10, right? So the first column is worth 1/10. The second column is worth 1/10. The third column is worth 1/10, because we're comparing it out of the entire whole grid. So if I know that each one is worth 1/10 and I have 7 of them, then I pick up my handy dandy calculator and I type in 7 times 0.1, don't forget the decimal point, and that tells me that that's the same as 0.7. So it is just simply 0.7%, also known as 7/10 of a percent, which you could write as a fraction as 7/10 followed by the percent sign. All right, so when we look at this last one then, just setting up the math becomes much easier than trying to figure out my equivalent ratios, I promise. You're going to understand it better if you just look at the ratio the way it's said and set up my division problem. Right, so if I know I have 4 hundredths of an inch to 8 inches at the end, then I'm just going to take my 4 hundredths and put it inside my division box and divide it by 8. Well, when I'm dividing, then I have to raise my decimal straight up, and then I have to start dividing. 8 won't go into 0, so I put a 0. 8 won't go into 4, so I put a 0. I add a 0, and then I know that 8 will go into 40 5 times. So we end up with the division part of it as 0.005. Going back to that first note that I had you take, I'm going to move my decimal from left to right 2 times. When I move it from left to right 2 times and I add my percent sign, I get 0.5%. If I look at the way they're telling me to do it, well, I would take 100 divided by 8 and figure out I'm multiplying by 12.5, and then I multiply 12.5 times 0.04, then I would also see that I still get 0.5. So the answer is going to be the same either way. But instead of having to figure out what the equivalent ratios are, I truly believe you're going to understand it better and be more successful if you simply do the division. All right, so right at 20 minutes, go back and rewatch it and review it. Make sure you're pausing and taking all the notes as we struggle. Once again, I'm ADHD and I struggle focusing sometimes. So we have to force ourselves to be willing to go back and rewatch it and take the notes and be involved in the lesson and paying attention to what's being said. If I'm presenting it or someone else is presenting it, that's how you'll be a better learner. All right, so on this page is your assignment. So I've taken them off on the image, but they're not out of your book. But those are the ones I want you to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, question 6, and then on the back side, 8, 9, and 10. This is due tomorrow.